Good afternoon and good morning to those of us in the US. I suppose it's good afternoon to many of you in the rest of the world. And welcome to session 12 of the 12th triannual ODC conference. This afternoon, we will be covering 4 different talks, and we will be saving all of our Q&A for the end of the 4 talks. So when you submit a question to the Q&A portion, please include the name of the person for whom the question is for. The first talk today is by Dr. Jeffrey Coalson from Louisiana State University, and it is the proactive control during continuous processing tasks in adults who stutter.
Hello, thanks for tuning in. My name is Jeff Coalson, and in this video, we'll discuss the role of proactivity in adults who stutter. My co-author is Dr. Treleaven, who will be presenting later in this session about an overlapping but distinct process known as inhibition, specifically verbal inhibition in adults who stutter. For the next 20 minutes or so, we'll focus on proactive control in adults who stutter, as viewed through the lens of recent work in anticipation and stuttering by Eric Jackson and others, and examined using one well-used measure of proactivity, the AX continuous performance task. So, anticipation. What is it? Why do we care? And how does it map onto this AX measure? Well, broadly speaking, anticipation is the sensation that something is about to happen based on contextual cues. Take any event that's important enough to grab your attention. Let's call it X. If it's preceded often enough by a specific cue, let's call that A, then you begin to develop a basic but not flawless rule. You learn to anticipate X based on A. And based on one's opinion of X and how they'd like it to unfold, most people will develop strategies, adaptive or otherwise, during this interval to prepare for X and achieve the desired goal. The development of the strategy is called proactivity or proactive control. Proactivity contrasts with our more basic bottom-up mode of operation, reactivity, wherein people wait until X to respond because they haven't had enough experience with this pattern yet, or perhaps they are less prone to rely on context cues, or perhaps X isn't all that important to them. But because proactive control tends to dominate learned behavior after 10 years of life, and we're looking at adults who stutter, proactivity will be the focus of today's presentation. And the parallels between A then X onto the surface features of stuttering are pretty intuitive. Almost all adults who stutter report that stutter speech is frequently preceded by some cue that it's going to occur, which leads to a state of anticipation. The role of anticipation serves as the basis of many influential theories of stuttering, and some recent definitions of stuttering where people who stutter describe it as a fundamental element of the experience of stuttering. So it's a relatively safe bet to assume that proactivity, or what a person does in anticipation of an upcoming event, plays a large role in the everyday life of an adult who stutters. And the potential role of proactivity is good news for adults who stutter. Recent research has found that proactivity is amenable to intervention. But what we don't know is what aspects of stuttering does proactivity impact. Conceivably, proactivity could be linked to what happens between the knowledge of an upcoming problematic word and its eventual production. As detailed by Jackson and colleagues, this could result in approach strategies or avoidance strategies during this interval, and both could be potentially problematic. For example, greater physical tension could lead to greater physical concomitants. For example, muscle tension, head movements, or eye movements. And it can also lead to avoidance tactics such as word substitutions or filler words. So to be clear, proactivity can come at a cost. But proactivity has been shown to permeate broader levels of processing and aspects of everyday life. Zooming out a bit, proactivity has been linked to a person's tendency to approach or avoid threatening stimuli, leading to a similar approach avoidance state across a range of communication behaviors and communication situations that we may be familiar with at this point. So in sum, we have reason to suspect that the underlying executive function of proactivity plays a large role in the everyday experience of stuttering in adults, and we know it's receptive to treatment. But the ways it may contribute to stuttering has yet to be determined, nor do we know if this proactivity is perhaps higher in adults who stutter because of their lifelong experience with stuttering and relying on these context cues, which leads us to our three research questions. Are adults who stutter more proactive than adults who don't? And is this proactivity linked to the severity of stuttering, or perhaps the experience of stuttering? So we recruited 45 adults, 22 of whom stutter, and they completed 4 tasks, the AX continuous performance task that we'll go into here in a bit and have touched on already, and then 3 measures that we should all be familiar with, the SSI, the OASIS, and the test of nonverbal intelligence. So the AX continuous performance task should look familiar at this point. It's an AQ followed by an X probe. And this pairing predominates the trials that the participant sees. It's A, then X. And the participant is only supposed to respond if this pattern has occurred. And they respond on the X. The remainder of the trials, the 30% of the trials that are not that AX pattern, are AY, BX, and BY trials. AY and BX are key and give insight into the person's tendency to be proactive or reactive. A false alarm on an AY trial is thought to reflect proactivity because they're trying to base their response on just the preceding cue. And a BX response is thought to reflect reactivity because they are disregarding the preceding cue and just relying on the X. And the BY is basically a foil. How do we measure proactivity? 3 that we use based on previous research: the reaction time of the X response during the accurate trial. So the faster they hit the X, that's thought to reflect a stronger proactive plan. And then there's the 2 accuracy measures, the DX index and the AQ bias. The DX index is the higher the DX index is thought to reflect a tendency to use context clues to be proactive. And then the AQ bias is thought to reflect perhaps an over-reliance on context cues with minimal adjustment in the presence of new information. So it's more invariant. Now, out of respect for your time and attention, I will skip over the first 2 findings because there's really not much to see. They were both null. Adults who stutter are not excessively proactive or reactive, and they have their normal range of proactivity was not linked to any aspect of the SSI or the surface level features of stuttering. So now we get to the good stuff, which is the link between proactivity and the experience of stuttering. And we did predict that proactivity could potentially share a relationship with the experience of stuttering as measured by the OASIS, specifically the sections that are dedicated to your reactions to stuttering, which emphasizes changing words and situational avoidance, and then possibly the section dedicated to communication in daily situations, which conceivably proactive pursuit of fluency in cross communicative situations may compromise communication quality and satisfaction. So we ran 3 linear regression analysis corresponding with the 3 indexes of proactivity, the RT, the D index, and the AQ bias, and they all included high predictors, the 4 subsections of the OASIS, and nonverbal intelligence. And we did find something. Specifically for the AQ bias, not for the D index and the RT. and specifically in the two subsections that we thought might be the most relevant, your reactions to your own stuttering and daily communication. And it accounted for a good deal of the variance in the model. But the interesting part is that one was positive and one was negative. And we'll go into this here in a bit. So in terms of communication in daily situations, the more proactive adults who stuttered tended to report more negative experiences during communication. And as mentioned, this may be a product of the pursuit of fluency. The proactive pursuit of fluency, communication is going to suffer. Plus, it's a reminder that this is an AQ bias, which means it's it's a more invariant type of proactivity that may not be as flexible to accommodate the wide range of situations that this includes, like work, home, small talk, school, and etc. But perhaps the more interesting and unexpected finding is that proactivity was linked to positive experiences, a positive impact on their own reactions to their own stuttering, which means or suggests that proactivity isn't always a bad thing. So was proactivity linked to the experience of stuttering? Yes, but not quite as expected. So let's discuss. So we demonstrated and saw that AWS are no more or less proactive than their fluent counterparts. And the proactivity that they did demonstrate was not linked to severity, but linked to the experience of stuttering. So the take home is that although it's noisy, this highly variable data had a significant trend. Proactivity provides information about the person's self-reported experiences with stuttering. What parts of the OASIS were affected by proactivity? So some ancillary analysis was more intriguing to me. In terms of the daily communication and subsections, there wasn't any patterns within section 3 that diverged from the others, but section 2, your reactions to stuttering, the effective proactivity was restricted to the last 10 questions, the cognitive beliefs about stuttering, 2C. And of those 10 questions, there was only 2 questions that really had a significant association with increased proactivity, and that was I do not want people to know that I stutter, and I do not speak as well as most other people, which means that proactivity was linked to participants disagreeing with these negative statements, which invites us and gives us permission to zoom out a bit more and explore this proactivity through the lens of cognitive beliefs and perhaps cognitive bias and perhaps cognitive reappraisal. Now, it's tricky to debate what is the response and what is the cue when it comes to cognitive bias and negative cognitions about stuttering, because the definition of a behavior gets murkier and the timeline is much longer than 2 seconds ISI. It can be a lifetime, but there are some concrete behaviors or lack of these behaviors that may reflect the underlying cognitive beliefs about stuttering that were observed in the study. So conceivably, the hesitancy to disclose stuttering is developed in response to something. It's a learned behavior. The hesitancy to apply to a job that you know you are qualified for is developed in response to something. These are learned behaviors, and these become rules learned across a lifetime that are practically covalent and hard to take down without some type of assistance or a very deliberate, conscious, proactive plan. So if these are the behaviors, what are the cues? It's speculative, but perhaps it's the overall stigma of stuttering. Perhaps it's personal negative experiences with stuttering that are extremely overt. Perhaps it's the very commonplace things you hear if you're a person who stutters, like, I don't even hear you're stuttering anymore, or I'm so proud of you, you're an inspiration to me. These are extremely well intended, but they are reminders of a certain concept that people don't want to hear you're stuttering. Perhaps it's things like your employer is asking if you're comfortable speaking with customers because of your stuttering. Perhaps it's the mixed message that we get going into the clinic, hearing, well, it's okay to stutter, but here's a bag of tricks to conceal as much as possible. So these repeated reminders that how you speak bothers people could lead to these lifelong and very hard to break patterns. And the fact that the proactivity in this study, the increased proactivity was associated with dispelling these beliefs was very interesting. That proactivity, while it does have its costs, can be harnessed for good and may be necessary to break the underlying behaviors that are the most detrimental to the quality of life and participation in life of people who stutter, irrespective of stuttering. So, while there are some gains, there are some costs to proactivity, much like anticipation. It's not 100% helpful. The dominance of proactivity after childhood has been referred to as a double-edged sword, and in fact, higher proactivity was linked to positive experiences in this study, and negative experiences, specifically in the realm of communication in daily situations. And there was overlap. The 2/3 of the respondents, of the same respondents, had positive and negative impacts of their increased proactivity. And in fact, the pros and cons of proactivity has been discussed in the realm of anticipation of stuttering, and I pulled this verbatim from Jackson et al. They use the exact same analogy. Anticipation or anticipating stuttering, it is a double-edged sword. If I think fast enough, I can usually figure out a way to make it through this sentence, but the anticipation hinders my ability to communicate because I'm not strategizing, because I'm strategizing while trying to speak fluently. So there's something to be said for a little bit of reactivity. Perhaps not trying to over control fluency and let communication happen, and perhaps be more present in the moment, stuttering a little bit and letting that happen, just trying to let go of the wheel a little bit. And by reappraising what we expect, we too can be flexible in what we expect will be the most helpful to our clients and to ourselves. Proactive in some cases, reactive in others. And this is really kind of the core of specific types of intervention, especially mindfulness intervention, that this attenuates a lot of the proactive tendencies that are not helpful. And thankfully, a lot of newer contemporary therapies start to include this into their program. So if you're interested in proactivity or any executive function in adults who stutter, let me know. I'll be looking at it for the next few years. And there's certainly more ground to cover and more to explore.
Thanks, Jeff, for a very interesting talk. Our next speaker will be Torrey Loucks from the University of Alberta, and his talk is titled Stuttering State Influences Speech Movement Variability, a Treatment Study.
Good morning. It's a great privilege to be able to present to you today and to participate in the Oxford 2020 Dysfluency Conference. Before I start, I want to acknowledge my colleagues on this study, Kristin Pelczarski and Holly Lomheim. The title of our study is How Stuttering State Influences Speech Motor Variability, a treatment study. I want to start this presentation by asking a basic question. Is there actually a speech motor deficit in stuttering? This question is relevant because accumulating research shows that stuttering is not confined to the domain of motor control only. Rather, what causes, maintains, and shapes stuttering is far more than motoric aberrations. Part of the rationale for asking this question is that the profile of stuttering itself is highly labile, being highly variable across people and highly variable across time within individuals. Some indication of this is the rapid shift in fluency state caused by, related to successful therapy or even just fluency-inducing strategies. This lability is captured in the state-trait distinction. Basically, state refers to how stuttering is currently manifested. Another way of asking this could be, how is the individual coping with their stuttering? And then also, what manner of speaking are they using? Now, opposed to trait, which is the core characteristics of stuttering, and I think of these as the underlying biological, genetic, neurological aspects that cause stuttering and may be responsible for maintaining stuttering in some way. I want to emphasize that other key attributes of the state of stuttering are the quality and manner of speaking and quite likely severity in many cases. Many of the speech motor differences that are reported in the literature could result from stuttering state. Now, there's an important caveat because we need to think about speech motor variability. This is an enduring difference in adults who stutter and children who stutter. Basically, they have higher speech movement variability for real word phrases and non-words. Do these constitute anomalies in motor control? Or is heightened variability also influenced by stuttering state? And if a relatively enduring change in state occurs, will variability change? Relatively enduring change in state is treatment in this study. And we predicted speech movement variability would decrease significantly as a function of successful intervention. An important thing to control in this study is speaking style, because if we compare pre-treatment speaking style to post-treatment use of fluency skills, we'll certainly see a change. Mostly in terms of a controlled and slower manner of speaking, but this may not lead to a decrease in variability. It could even lead to an increase in variability. So we wanted to mediate this possible effect by contrasting a preferred manner of speaking with fluency skills. And if participants use this preferred manner of speaking both pre-treatment and post-treatment, then we could compare them to the use of fluency skills. Now, we predicted, based on clinical evidence, that stuttering rate and severity would decrease for both speaking conditions, i.e. preferred manner, and with fluency skills following therapy. The participants in this study were 13 adults who stutter who completed the Intensive Comprehensive Stuttering Program at ISTAR called CSP, and then 10 adults who do not stutter recruited from the local community. We're continuing to recruit from this study, but as you can imagine, it's on hold for a while. The CSP is an intensive treatment program offered to adults, teens, and school-age kids. Over 5,000 clients have completed it. It blends fluency shaping, stuttering modification, and cognitive behavioral techniques. Long-term efficacy at 1- and 5-year follow-ups have been demonstrated. Each adult in the study successfully completed the program. We obtained reading and speaking samples pre and post, not related to the movement recording, and from these we've calculated percentage syllable stuttered and SPM so far. A little bit more about the speaking conditions. This is a preferred casual manner of speaking, as if you're speaking with a close friend or family member, and avoid any therapy strategies. We got a pre-treatment speech movement recording close to the first day of CSP, and then a post-treatment movement recording very close to the last day of CSP. immediately following the post-treatment movement recording with preferred manner of speaking, we asked subjects to then use their treatment skills, and we repeated the experiment. The stimuli for the movement recording were 2 real word utterances. One was 6 syllables long, "Bye Bobby a puppy," then 10 syllables, and then 1 non-word utterance called "Bobbly free pawap." And subjects heard and repeated this non-word at least 3 times till they could repeat it without errors. And all of this was presented in a randomized order. The movement recording conforms to many previous studies of speech movement variability. We used an OptiTrack to follow motions of the upper lip, lower lip, and chin. Sampled these at 100 samples per second in a head-centered reference frame, and then we analyzed lip motions based on subjects reading these sentences on a computer screen. The dependent variables were calculated in a very similar manner as previous studies. For a cross-utterance variation, we calculated the STI of lower lip motion and the LAV of combined upper lip, lower lip motion. Based on 10 fluent utterances, we did the spatial and temporal normalization and some standard deviation of 50 points. We also got the kinematic duration of these utterances. I'm going to be briefly mentioning another analysis that we use to calculate within utterance variation based on Jackson et al. And we use percentage determinism and max line with the same parameters that was used in that study. Okay, shifting to the results. On the left-hand axis, we have percentage syllables stuttered. On the right-hand axis, we have syllables per minute. And as you can see, at pre-treatment, participants had a high rate of stuttering. This dropped significantly at post-treatment for the preferred manner of speaking and when using fluency skills. Syllables per minute increased significantly only for the preferred manner of speaking. There was much more variability in the fluency skills condition, but this indicates participants were had met the criteria for successfully completing the program. Now, shifting to the movement variability and duration results, I want to talk about the simple short utterance first because it provides the pattern for the other results. Basically, on the left-hand axis, we have STI of the lower lip. The results for the lip aperture variability were almost identical, so I'm only reporting the lower lip data. Now, at pre-treatment, there was a significant difference in STI, with the persons who stutter in blue being significantly more variable than fluent controls. Now, at post-treatment, for the same manner of speaking and for when using fluency skills, there was a significant decrease in variability for the persons who stutter. There was a post-treatment residual difference between the adults who stutter and the controls. So even though variability dropped significantly for the adults who stutter, there was still a significant difference relative to typically fluent speakers. Shifting to duration, we see that at pre-treatment, there was a significant difference between the two groups, with typically fluent speakers speaking more rapidly. Now, there was a significant increase in duration when individuals used their fluency skills and a marginal decrease in duration when they were using a preferred manner of speaking. There was still a residual difference in duration post-treatment between the two groups. Okay, this provides the template for the next two utterances. Basically, same results in terms of variability for the simple long utterance. Significant decrease in variability for both post-treatment speaking conditions and group differences that persisted after treatment. Duration is a little bit different, but what is similar is this pre-treatment group difference and a increase in duration post-treatment when using fluency skills, but now we see a significant decrease in duration when using preferred manner of speaking. And there was no difference between the groups post-treatment. So this hints at a dissociation. With fluency skills, when using fluency skills, there can be a significant decrease in duration, but a significant decrease in variability, but a significant increase in duration. Opposite for when using a preferred manner of speaking. Significant decrease in variability, but also a significant decrease in duration. For the non-word, similar pattern. Decreases in variation for both speaking conditions, but an increase in duration when using fluency skills, but the preferred manner of speaking is significantly faster than when using fluency skills, and some persistent group differences. Now, for intra-utterance variability, which I'm not going to comment on very much, we see an interesting dissociation here again. Basically, there can be a decrease in decrease in these measures post-treatment for a preferred manner of speaking, but an increase in these measures when using fluency skills. And this suggests that even though subjects can become more fluent in both of these speaking conditions, the manner in which fluency is achieved is quite different. And I'm very happy to discuss this more in the Q&A. To account for the results, I suggest that adults who stutter are showing a form of bistability. This is represented in this schematic in which we have kinematic variability and duration. Pre-treatment, participants show high variability and intermediate duration. Post-treatment, individuals show a decrease in variability for different speaking conditions that vary considerably in duration. And so adults who stutter are able to take on two different modes of speaking that are distinguished by duration, and these speakers can shift between these states. One conclusion from this is that speech kinematic variability appears to be an index of stuttering state. And this is similar to what severity measures may tell us, but instead we're talking about fluent speech rather than having a symptom focus. The other important point that is indicated in this study is that kinematic variability is clearly not determined by speaking rate. So let's return to our original question. Is there a speech motor deficit in stuttering? One thing that we should be comfortable talking about are speech motor differences in stuttering. They certainly exist, but they're not necessarily a deficit when we consider current speaking state. Does this mean there is no deficit? It's possible there is still a sensory motor integration deficit or limitation of some kind that is still captured in movement variability. But it's this residual variability following a change in state towards more fluent speech where we want to look for a difference in sensory motor control or a deficit limitation in sensory motor control, this residual variability. It will be subtle in the speech domain, but potentially more apparent in the audio motor domain. Now, even though this brings us back to considering deficit limitation, I also want to point out that treatment can unmask or reveal sensory motor potential in stuttering, quite substantial potential. And so any conversation about sensory motor control should view motor potential along with motor limitations. Now, there's a lot more that I'd like to talk about, such as kinematic control using fluency skills, kinematic control during preferred manner of speaking, and some of the things that we need to do better. I want to thank you for listening in on my presentation, and I want to acknowledge the iStar clients, the iStar clinicians, my colleagues again, and the student research assistants. Okay, I'm looking forward to your questions.
Microphone. Microphone.
Sally, you are muted, sorry.
Oh, hello everyone. Sorry, I stayed muted. In this day and age, at this time in the pandemic, I should have learned my lesson already. I'd like to thank Dr. Torrey Loucks for that presentation. That was fantastic. And thank you also to my co-moderator, Dr. Frank Gunther, for sharing the stage here with me. Next, I'd like to thank and congratulate Dr. Shanley Treleaven from Louisiana State University for her newly earned PhD and introduce her talk entitled Verbal Response Inhibition in Adults Who Stutter.
I'm Shanley Treleaven, and I'm here to talk to you all today about verbal response inhibition in stuttering in adults. I worked on this project with my mentor, Dr. Jeffrey Coalson at Louisiana State University, and we focused on response inhibition, which is the ability to stop an unwanted motor action after this action's already been initiated. Specifically, verbal response inhibition, which is inhibiting speech or stopping speech after speech has already been initiated. And this is something we think is particularly relevant for persons who stutter. And we aren't the first people to look at response inhibition in persons who stutter. The majority of the data and the majority of the literature has been focused on children who stutter. Kurt Eggers and Julie Anderson have studied this, and they have some great literature out there on this topic, as well as other researchers. Here, though, we're going to focus on adults who stutter. And first, Nicole Neef and colleagues did a couple of neuroimaging studies where they found that inhibition regions in the right hemisphere of people who stutter are overactive. And then looking at connectivity in these inhibition regions, in some regions, greater connectivity was related to greater stuttering severity. But in other inhibition regions, greater connectivity was related to less stuttering severity. And this was the first time I realized that maybe inhibition isn't always something that can be helpful for stuttering. These researchers suggested that increased inhibition might be related to increased anticipation of stuttering, and this might bring about dysfluencies. In getting to behavioral data that is behaviorally looked at response inhibition, the stop signal task is the most typical way to go about this. And 3 studies have studied inhibition in adults who stutter this way, all finding that inhibition speeds in adults who stutter are slowed compared to adults who do not stutter. If you can see the effect sizes here, this is a pretty stable phenomenon. So in some, it's looking like there are inhibition differences between adults who do and do not stutter. One thing that I want to point out about all 3 of these stop signal studies, though, is that all of them have focused on manual inhibition, or the ability to stop a button press. And there are ways to study inhibition of speech, verbal inhibition. And this might be more relevant for people who stutter. This is what a verbal stop signal task would look like. The participant would be presented on the majority of trials with ghost stimuli, where they would respond verbally. In this case, they would name bucket. Then the minority of trials are what test inhibition. The participant will be presented with their ghost stimuli, just like on a go trial, but sometime after this presentation, it will change color, signaling the participant to stop their already initiated speech. And the variable that we care about from this task is the SSRT, or the stop signal reaction time. This is our inhibition speed. The greater this is, the larger the number the SSRT is, that means inhibition would be slower. So the participant would be less likely to be able to adequately inhibit their speech. But if the SSRT is lower or smaller, that means that they're faster in terms of their inhibition, and that means they would be more likely to inhibit their unwanted speech. So keep SSRT in mind, because this is the variable that we're going to be considering and talking about a lot during this presentation. There is some verbal stop signal research that is dealt with adults who do not stutter. Sometimes participants are responding to letters, such as consonants or maybe single vowels. They can be naming images, like in the previous slide, as you saw. And some of these studies compared manual and verbal SSRTs because it is easier to use a manual button press task than to get vocal response time data. And two of the more recent studies did not find that verbal and manual inhibition speeds are correlated with one another. But one of the older studies it all did, and this is a strong study, they found a relationship between verbal and manual inhibition speeds, both behaviorally and neurologically. And they thought there might be an underlying inhibition construct that relates verbal and manual inhibition. So the data is mixed, and we aren't positive if we can use a manual button press task to generalize to stopping unwanted speech. And there are going to be considerations for verbal stop signal tasks. Everything listed here for the present study, we did our best to consider and control for if at all possible. I do want to highlight emotions because emotions can alter inhibition speed. They can impact inhibition speed. In the majority of studies, and this is with adults who do not stutter, they found that in the presence of emotional stimuli, inhibition speed became faster. But in some studies, inhibition speed became slower in the presence of emotional stimuli. And what this might mean is that maybe sometimes the cognitive process of inhibition freezes, slowing inhibition, but maybe sometimes the motor process freezes, allowing inhibition to win, allowing inhibition to be fast enough to stop the unwanted motor process. So either way, we know that emotions can mitigate inhibition. For our study, we considered 17 adults who stutter, who we matched by nonverbal IQ, with 17 adults who do not stutter. And all of our participants completed the test of nonverbal intelligence, which was our covariate, expressive and receptive vocabulary test, because we didn't want vocabulary level to impact naming speed, particularly when participants are naming images. And then our participants completed the ASRS-5, which is our ADHD screener. And this is because ADHD can be linked to slower inhibition. For our adults who stutter, we measured overt stuttering using the SSI-4 and its components. And then we wanted to measure the adverse impact from stuttering, this lived experience with stuttering, using the OASIS and its components. And we were specifically interested in the Your Reactions to Stuttering subsection, because arguably during a moment of speech, the emotional component would be a reaction to stuttering. And if this impacts executive functioning, we want to be able to study this. For our experimental tasks, our participants completed a manual stop signal task where they responded to arrows presented on screen using the arrow keys on the keyboard. And then we had 3 verbal stop signal tasks, one where participants named 2 letters, and then to increase lexical complexity, we had a 2 image naming task. And to add even more complexity and to make it so participants didn't have their 2 stimuli in their working memory, we had a 12 image naming task. The participants couldn't really predict what stimuli would come next. For our research questions, we had 4. First, we wanted to contribute to the literature to see whether you can use manual inhibition tasks to generalize to stopping verbal speech. So are these manual and verbal SSRTs correlated to one another? For our second research question, we wanted to see what group differences there might be in terms of verbal inhibition. And then for our last 2 research questions, we focused solely on adults who stutter. And we wanted to see how verbal inhibition is related to overt stuttering severity and how verbal inhibition is related to the adverse experience of stuttering. And this is a short presentation, so in order to consolidate and for the purpose of time, I'm going to go over the first 2 research questions really quickly with you all right now. For our first question, we did not find that manual inhibition was related to verbal inhibition. And this might mean that we should be cautious when we're using manual data to generalize to speech in the future, particularly for people who stutter. And then for our second research question, we didn't find group differences at all, which is very different from what all 3 behavioral studies looking at inhibition in adults who stutter have found. They all found, these are 2 studies by myself and Dr. Coalson, they all found that the adults who stutter had slowed inhibition compared to the control group. And we didn't find that here. This might mean that at baseline, adults who do and do not stutter might not have inhibition differences after all. We're going to get into the next two research questions now. We're going to go into them in a little bit more detail. And again, they're focusing on just the stuttering participants. For our third research question, we wanted to relate verbal inhibition to overt stuttering. We predicted there would be a significant relationship between these two variables. We measured this using a multiple regression, where our independent variables were the percentage of stuttered syllables, duration of stuttering, and physical concomitants, so the components of the SSI, and we used these to predict verbal inhibition speed, and we used Tony as a covariate here. And we didn't find a significant relationship between overt stuttering and verbal response inhibition. As you can see, the model is non-significant. There's not a really significant slope here, except for the secondary characteristics to stuttering section. This section did have a significant relationship with verbal inhibition. This is a negative relationship. So as the secondary characteristics increased or became more severe, inhibition speed became faster, which was a little bit unexpected. Overall, though, the model was non-significant. Overall, overt stuttering did not seem to predict verbal inhibition. We did find that one component where secondaries were negatively related to inhibition speed, and that was in line with what Neef et al. Found, where they had that greater connectivity, that greater inhibition related to greater stuttering severity. But I do think our finding was weaker than what Neef et al. Found, because when we took out our two participants who had ADHD symptoms, this finding became null. And this is the only finding we had that changed upon removing these two participants. Maybe if there isn't a relationship between overt stuttering and response inhibition, maybe there will be a relationship between response inhibition and the experience with stuttering. And that's what's up next. We did predict a relationship here. We did a very similar regression model as the previous research question, except we use subsections of the OASIS as our independent variables here. That would be your reactions to stuttering and general information subsections of the OASIS. And the reason we only use these two was so we could fit assumptions for the regression model. The other two subsections of the OASIS were too highly correlated to the your reactions to stuttering subsection in order to be independent predictors for the model. So we only use these two. And then we used those subsections again to predict verbal SSRT. We did find a significant regression model here. What was interesting, though, is that there are different directions in the way the variables are related to one another. For the general information subsection of the OASIS, this is a positive relationship that's significant. So as the scores became greater or there's a greater adverse impact, and these were specifically related to greater discomfort in using fluency enhancing techniques or greater perceived stuttering severity. So as these scores became greater, inhibition speed became slower or SSRT became greater. But in an opposite finding for your reactions to stuttering, as greater reactions to stuttering were reported, inhibition speeds were faster. And this is more in line with the non-stuttering literature, which found that in the presence of emotional stimuli, inhibition speeds tended to become faster. Again, we did seem to find a relationship between this experience with stuttering and verbal response inhibition. But what does that mean? We think this means that maybe instead of executive functioning impacting stuttering, maybe stuttering or the experience with stuttering impacts executive functions. And this is something that's really important to note because adults who stutter need adequate access to executive functions. Every person needs adequate access to executive functions. And this is something that clinicians should consider. And this is something that we're going to need to do more work on going forward, especially if executive functioning really is mitigated by the experience with stuttering. And it's a good thing that we have such a great support system because we do have more work to do on this. We have a wonderful team at the LSU Developmental Stuttering Lab. They worked really hard on this project, and I hope they get to see this video. Dr. Coalson has an R21 grant that has supported everything that we've done. It's been incredible, and we're so grateful to have this. LSU and the Delta Zeta Foundation has also supported us very well. So we're very grateful for them, and we're very grateful for you all for taking the time to listen to this presentation. And please make sure to reach out if you have any questions for us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shanley. Our last presentation in this session, which will be followed by questions. I encourage you to take a look at the questions also and rank the ones you are most interested in. The last presentation is by Vincent Gracco from Haskins Laboratories, Yale University and McGill University, and the title is Structural Brain Networks, Alterations in Persistent Stuttering. Vince, I believe you're muted.
Screen, sir, there is a mute button.
In the bottom of your dashboard, there is a red microphone.
Hello, Vincent, can you hear me? So, sir, if you look on your screen, in the bottom centre, there is there should be a microphone icon, which will currently be red. And if you just press it, it should unmute you.
There we go.
Oh, perfect.
Sorry. Leave it to me to screw up. And I'm also getting feedback. Now, let me try this. No, I'm still getting feedback. Let me close this. Let me take these out. Okay. I assume everybody. It's a lot of feedback.
Hi, Vin.
I think I got it.
Yeah, if you have any other tabs.
Yeah, I once again, I screwed up. Okay. Sorry for that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our recent work looking at structural brain network alterations in persistent stuttering in a group of adult stutterers. And I would just like to acknowledge the contributions from my co-authors, Anastasia Sares, who is my doctoral student and is now doing a postdoc at Concordia University, and Nabin Koirala, who is a postdoc at Haskins Laboratories. So by way of introduction, I think we all know that stuttering is a neurodevelopmental speech disorder whose overt symptoms affect speech fluency. So over the last 20 plus years, there have been numerous brain-based studies of the motor, sensory, and sensory motor aspects of speech production in individuals who stutter. The motivation has been wide-ranging, from developing mechanisms to explain the disorder, to identifying factors related to persistence and recovery, which we heard today from Suan, and to assess changes secondary to treatment. Generally, the focus of these studies, and I'm using a generalization here, but and especially early on, but generally the focus of the studies have been restricted to brain areas assumed to be most relevant to the speech production process. With the application of more sensitive tools, newer imaging tools, and techniques, brain regions beyond the speech motor network have been implicated in stuttering that more adequately reflect network-based differences. And I've just listed a few studies here. There are certainly more than I've listed. I apologize for anybody I left out. So our perspective is that if we're going to develop a comprehensive understanding of the neural consequences of persistent stuttering, then we need to focus on, at least initially, the networks and interregional connectivity, because they have the possibility of providing important insight into the consequences of this neurodevelopmental disorder. So the current study is an evaluation of the structural connectome in a group of adults who stutter, focused on network connectivity differences and network organization, using a number of tools. And the most recent work that we're doing is drawing from graph theory. So as way of an outline, I'd like to go over briefly the new diagnostic label for stuttering, which is a nice segue into early childhood risk factors, as well as the disorder as a neurodevelopmental disorder, and then focus on the data we have that it involves structural network connectivity analysis, graph theory approaches to look at network hubs and community structure, and then graph theory to look at network controllability, which is a recent finding that's kind of interesting. So as I'm sure you know, that stuttering is no longer a diagnostic label, at least according to DSM-5. It's now called child onset fluency disorder. And the characteristics include interruptions in normal fluency and time patterning of speech, which is certainly not new. The interruptions in fluency get in the way with academic or occupational accomplishments or with social communication. And if a speech motor or sensory deficit is evident, the speech challenges are in excess of those typically connected with these problems. There are also some additional factors that come into play associated with accessory symptoms. And it may be the case that there may be deficits in intellectual functions like reasoning, problem solving, planning, abstract thinking, judgment, academic learning, and learning from experience. There may be deficits in adaptive functioning that end up in failure to achieve developmental and sociocultural standards for personal autonomy and social responsibility. And lacking continuing support, the adaptive deficits hinder functioning in one or more activities of daily life, including communication, social participation, and independent living across multiple environments like home, school, work, and community. So, this is from the diagnostic manual. The nice thing about this is that it's a fairly comprehensive picture of the potential problems associated with child onset fluency disorders. And it also provides a dynamic perspective, incorporating the influences of personal history, which brings us to early childhood risk factors. So we all know that the most common risk factors include family history, age of and time of onset, gender, and other comorbid disorders, the most common of which is ADHD and to a lesser extent ASD, as well as other speech and language problems. But there are also other childhood risk factors that include neuropsychiatric conditions such as parental anxiety and parental obsessive compulsive disorder. And additional risk factors include socioeconomic status, or at least associated factors. They're not necessarily high risk, but they're associated. Socioeconomic status, prenatal, perinatal, and postnatal issues, maternal alcohol consumption during pregnancy, low birth weight, impaired child-parent interactions, conflict with parents, negative parental reactions to normal childhood dysfluency, emotional reactivity, and a sensitive temperament. So there is a spectrum of concomitant risk factors in stuttering impacting neurodevelopment. So when we think about stuttering as a neurodevelopmental disorder, differences in brain structure and function are a hallmark of neurodevelopmental disorder, and they result from perturbations in the developmental process. So the disorders themselves generally are associated with alterations in neurogenesis, cell migration, and neural connectivity differerences, among other things, or consequences. So for a persistent neurodevelopmental disorder with multiple etiologies, risk factors, socio-emotional, and cognitive consequences, we might expect a wide range of neurodevelopmental changes. What we observe in adults who stutter is, when we look at them neurally, is compensation or adaptation, I think is a better word, in response to the development or the developmental and subsequent events that have impacted neural network organization. So if we look at neuroimaging studies, both structural and functional, with some notable exceptions, and I mentioned some of them briefly earlier, and in contrast to clinical studies, the neuroimaging studies have focused predominantly on the overt symptoms of the disorder and its severity, often to the exclusion of the accessory symptoms that are part of, if nothing else, part of the definition, but part of the actual disorder itself. And so what we're left with is a mismatch between the information the clinician or therapist integrates and synthesizes in order to treat the individual and the behavioral neural structures and function focused on in many neuroimaging studies of stuttering. Well, this can create a bit of a problem in terms of for neuroimaging studies, because if we want to avoid the parable of the blind scientist and the elephant, we need to think about what we're really looking at. And brain function is not solely attributable to individual regions and connections, but emerges from the topology of the network as a whole, essentially the connectome of the brain. And it's been suggested 15 years ago now that the connectome will significantly increase our understanding of how functional brain states emerge from their underlying structural substrate, and will provide new mechanistic insights into how brain function is affected if this structural substrate is disrupted. And I think that over the last 10 to 15 years, this is certainly shown to be true in a number of neurodevelopmental disorders. And because neurodevelopmental disorders in general are associated with atypical development and maturation in brain networks. So this brings us to the study that I'm going to talk about, the data that we have. We have 33 subjects, 13 adults who stutter, and 20 healthy controls. We have a bit of a, this is my first caveat, we have a bit of a odd mix here, more female adults who stutter than males. We had a speech-language pathologist assess stuttering severity using the SSI-4, and all stuttering participants self-rated their stuttering severity and speaking anxiety on a scale of 1 to 9, with 1 corresponding to no stuttering or no anxiety, and 9 being very severe stuttering, very severe speaking anxiety, reflecting their experience with speech in daily life. So this is another caveat here. We didn't have a real quantitative or normed estimate of their anxiety level or social anxiety level, but we have what we have. We collected anatomical images and diffusion weighted images, and you can see the parameters there if you're interested. The T1 images, the anatomical images, were used to parcellate the cortical and subcortical structures into 116 regions of interest using the automated anatomical labeling atlas for each subject. And just in case you're not familiar with that, this is what the parcellization looks like. So the different colors represent the different regions of the cortical and subcortical areas. And here is a breakdown of the nodes that were used, or the regions that were used. So there were 30, can you see the current presenter in the camera box? I can see me in the camera box. There were 30 frontal lobe nodes, 15 bilateral nodes, and they're listed here, and I don't need to read them off. 10 bilateral nodes in the temporal lobe, 6 bilateral nodes that made up the parietal lobe. Then we had the insula bilaterally, anterior cingulate, mid-cingulate, and posterior cingulate, the occipital lobe, then the central structures, the caudate, putamen, pallidum, and thalamus, as well as 26 posterior fossa structures that were that represented the cerebellum, the anterior posterior cerebellum, left and right hemispheres, as well as the vermis, which is the midline structure. So our approach, at least initially, was to take the diffusion images and estimate the probability distribution of connections from each seed voxel to build a connectivity matrix. So here's an example of the DTI data, that was integrated with the anatomical parcellization, came up with anatomical networks, and then we used network-based statistics to essentially evaluate the differences in connectivity. So we used probabilistic tractography to assess differences in the connectivity. We set up a threshold of the T statistic based on 5,000 permutations to build up a null distribution, and then from there we can determine what the appropriate T values are. We identified regions showing impaired connectivity when compared to healthy controls with a significance level of P less than 0.05. We also, because we collected the severity and anxiety scores, we also computed Pearson correlation coefficients between the results of the scores and the connectivity strength. So here's the first result that I want to show you. The structural connectivity, first of all the connectivity differences, the adults who stuttered were less than healthy controls. There was nothing the other way around. And this is at a p-value of 0.02. So before I go over the specifics, one of the things I think you can see is that there's a lot of crossed connectivity differences. And as a matter of fact, I think it's something like 75% of the connectivity, the reduction in connectivity were interhemispheric as opposed to within the hemisphere. The, whoops, wrong place. So here's, for the left hemisphere, we identified, or I just kind of organized 4 different regions. So we have on the precentral gyrus in the left hemisphere, which is located right here, it showed reduced connectivity with the left cuneus, which is right here, and the right hippocampus, parahippocampus, amygdala, and the globus pallidus. For the postcentral gyrus, the primary sensory cortex, it showed reduced connectivity to the globus pallidus bilaterally. Excuse me. The posterior cingulate, which is located here and is part of the default mode network, showed reduced connectivity with the amygdala on the left hemisphere and the other posterior cingulate on the right side. And then the caudate showed reduced connectivity with the thalamus in the left hemisphere. If we look at the right hemisphere, there's, again, a lot of crossed connectivity reductions. The posterior cingulate, we already talked about the posterior cingulate to the posterior cingulate. Posterior cingulate to the on the right hemisphere showed reduced connectivity with the amygdala, the caudate, the putamen, and the globus pallidus, and the cuneus, the right hemisphere here, showed reduction in connectivity to the caudate and the globus pallidus. The cerebellar region showed a number of areas of reduced connectivity on the right cerebellum to the left hemisphere predominantly. And these are the regions in the left hemisphere, the precentral, postcentral, putamen, globus pallidus, and the thalamus, that these regions in the cerebellum on the right hemisphere showed reduced connectivity. The point I would like to make about the cerebellum is that in bold here, lobules 888, those are the only areas of the cerebellar hemisphere in the right hemisphere, on the right side, that are considered motor representations. Crus 1 and Crus 2 and lobules 10 are all considered non-motor representations, and they reflect connections and functions associated with executive function, cognitive processing, and the default mode network. So this is kind of interesting. I think it's important to understand that while the cerebellum may be playing an important part in persistent stuttering, we need to make sure that we're looking at where those areas are located. We also looked at a slightly less robust cutoff, but still less than 0.05, 0.047. And I'm not going to go through all this. These are the additional reduced connectivities that were identified at this higher threshold. And you can see that for the most part, we're still talking about hippocampus, cuneus, angular gyrus, which is also part of the default mode network, the temporal pole superior, the amygdala, precuneus. There are a lot of regions here that show reduced connectivity to not only to motor structures, but to other regions in the on the cortical surface that would be considered non-motor. So I think this is kind of an important understanding that, as Torrey was saying yesterday, stuttering is not just a speech motor problem. As I mentioned, we looked at connectivity, the relationship of connectivity and stuttering severity, and we found no connectivity relationship with stuttering severity or self-assessed stuttering severity, although stuttering severity and self-assessed stuttering severity were highly correlated. But in contrast, what we found was self-assessed anxiety, speaking anxiety, was correlated with 3 connectivity pairs, and they're shown here. The right cuneus and the left putamen, the left precentral gyrus and the left hippocampus, and the right cuneus and the left pallidum or globus pallidus. And the one showing the strongest relationship at a negative 0.69 was the left precentral gyrus and the left hippocampus. So the connectivity observations, using network-based statistics, we found reduced structural connectivity in adults who stutter in spatially distributed brain areas, including major hubs of the default mode network, and limbic regions, to motor or sensory motor regions in the left hemisphere. The reduced connectivity was found in non-motor cerebellar regions on the right hemisphere, to sensory motor areas in the left hemisphere. And there was no relationship between reduced connectivity and stuttering severity, but reduced connectivity was associated with self-assessed anxiety. So this gives us a little bit of a picture, but it really doesn't take us into the idea of looking at brain networks, and where we can still get caught up in trying to identify parts of the elephant with our blinders on. So we opened up the window a little bit, and we're looking at hubs, network hubs, and this is where we applied graph theory, which will be applied through the rest of the talk. So hubs are highly connected regions in a network, which are crucial components for efficient communication and important regulators of information flow. There are, in terms of brain science, they are anatomically distinct modules with distinct patterns of connectivity. So we took our weighted connectivity matrix, which is this here, after doing the network-based statistics, and applied graph theoretical measures to identify network hubs. So a hub is a node with a number of links that greatly exceeds the average, and network hubs were computed using 2 network measures, degree and between the centrality. And this is a little cartoon here that shows, first of all, degree is often thought of in terms of strength, but it's the number of edges in a graph, and edges are connections connecting the node with all other nodes. So in general, the greater the degree, the more nodes it's connected to, and the more important it may be in the brain network. So here's an example of a low degree node. It's connected to a couple of other nodes, but then you have this high degree node that's connected to many more in addition to the cross-module connection. In terms of betweenness centrality, it's a measure of the centrality in a graph based on shortest paths. And a node with higher betweenness centrality would have more control over the network because more information passes through that node, so it impacts the flow of information. So you can see that this node here, which is labeled as high centrality, connects with all these other nodes, and then it also connects with another hub or another module. So what did we find? Well, we found for hubs that exceeded, and the way you do this is that you look at the number of connections and you come up with a mean number, and then you create a distribution. And so hubs that exceeded 1 and 2 standard deviations are plotted here. The blue reflects differences between the groups. The larger circles are 2 standard deviations from the mean, which is a more robust finding, but we also included the 1 standard deviation. So what you can see is there are 2 main nodes in the putamen bilaterally for both groups. But then you have the thalamus for the adults who stutter, who they're larger, more robust, but for the healthy controls, they're much smaller. They're only exceed 1 standard deviation. And then the precuneus in the healthy controls was bilateral and a robust degree, node degree, and it was somewhat different in the adults who stutter, and that's just what's highlighted here. The hubs based on degree revealed a weaker node in the left precuneus in the adults who stutter, and stronger bilateral nodes in the thalamus for the adults who stutter compared to the healthy controls. There were other differences that I've just highlighted here at the 1 standard deviation threshold, and they include, for the most part, some additional nodes in the adults who stutter, the mid-occipital gyrus and the olfactory gyrus, and some missing nodes in the adults who stutter that were found in the healthy controls. And this is the frontal superior orbital region in the right hemisphere, the middle cingulate gyrus in the right hemisphere, and the fusiform gyrus in the right hemisphere. So the results suggest potentially reduced information transfer through the left precuneus and a heavier reliance on the thalamus for the adults who stutter. The hubs of betweenness centrality differ from those obtained using degree, as the node acts as a bridge between 2 groups of nodes. And here's the result. And for the adults who stutter, the precuneus and the lingual gyrus on the left was weaker compared to the healthy controls. And this is important. I didn't mention it in the previous slide that also involved the precuneus, but the precuneus plays a core role in the default mode network and is more broadly, and also more broadly through its engagement in a variety of processing states. So again, we see a difference in the precuneus in the adults who stutter. And there were also some additional differences in the noted in the left cerebellum here, the fusiform gyrus again, and the mid-occipital gyrus for the adults who stutter. So some potential implications of the network hubs in adults who stutter. The differences in degree and betweenness centrality suggest differential processing loads in a number of networks for the adults who stutter compared to the healthy controls. The reduction in information transfer in the precuneus would substantially impact the default network, which has been implicated as the top of a representational cortical hierarchy processing transmodal information. And what that means is kind of a mouthful, but it means that it's an important hub in not related to sensory information per se, or even sensory motor information that's been integrated, but is kind of at a higher level in the hierarchy that takes that information and utilizes it for cognitive functioning. So given the extensive contribution of the precuneus to the default mode network, the degradation may also be the cause of the increase in connectivity strength in the thalamus. And this increased connectivity strength in the thalamus would have substantial effect on the transfer of information to cortical regions directly connected to the thalamus, which they all are. So this is kind of an important difference. And in Suan's talk, she also mentioned the thalamus as an important region here in terms of childhood stuttering. So next, how do brains cohere into modular networks? Because now we have some sense of kind of the hubs. So we looked at community structure, and in the context of networks, community structure refers to the occurrence of nodes in a network that are more densely connected internally than with the rest of the network. The nodes or modules are derived from a decomposition of the network into subcomponents that are internally strongly coupled, but are externally only weakly coupled. I was thinking about, a good example of this is that you take something like Heathrow Airport, which is a hub, a major hub. There's a lot of stuff going on in Heathrow. And then you take Gatwick, which I'm making this up because I don't know for a fact, but Gatwick is probably a smaller hub, but there's connections or communication between the two. But within those two groups, they're more highly connected within themselves than across each other. So, and you can, this will be a little clearer in a minute as well. So modularity is a method that we use to optimize, to detect community structure in networks. So first, why do we even care about community structure? Well, it provides a way to evaluate the possible structural adaptations resulting from neurodevelopmental consequences from a more holistic perspective. Gives us an idea about how the neural architecture has changed as a result of having to adapt to lifelong stuttering. And any atypical differences may reflect on developmentally relevant mechanisms for improvement or recovery, and the mechanisms underlying adaptation may inform early intervention research and improve diagnostic specificity. And it also may be the case that differences may be at the base of the clinical heterogeneity characteristic of stuttering. And this is something that hasn't been talked about much today, and I won't talk about it much either, but heterogeneity in this population is pretty substantial. So we use two different methods to compute the community structure based on assortative and disortative methods. And I'll show you what those are in just a second. Modularity maximization, which is one of the most common, captures communities that are internally dense and externally sparse, and can be described as segregated and autonomous. So here's an example, a nice cartoon where you have, and again, this kind of goes back to the airport analogy maybe, that you have a module here that's really well connected and a module here that's really well connected internally, and there's a sparse connection between the two. And so what we're talking about is something that is relatively autonomous and segregated, but is doing a lot of work. But the problem is that this approach, modularity maximization, can overlook some important and functionally relevant characteristics of neural circuits, which exhibit non-assortative wiring. So our second approach is something called the weighted stochastic block model. That's a generative modeling approach that explicitly considers patterned interaction between communities and accommodates functional networks better. It is actually, as you'll see, that it gives you a little insight into functional connectivity, not entirely. Excuse me. So we use we used a hierarchical clustering algorithm, the Louvain method, and it optimized on 7 different non-overlapping modules. So this is our first attempt at community structures. And the different modules are labeled by color, and I gave them names. I just made these up based on their anatomical components generally. But you can see there's a lateral orbital frontal, we'll stick with the healthy controls here, that is in red. Then we have an anterior medial frontal that's in blue. That's this one right here. We have a medial module that's in orange that reflects the medial wall motor areas. We have posterior medial lateral that's in gold, the temporoparietal, which is in purple, frontoparietal, which is in green, and then the cerebellum, which is in baby blue. So when we looked at the components within these modules, it was interesting that the medial module, the orange one, and the cerebellum were similarly clustered. So all the structures that were in one for the healthy controls were also in those for the adults who stutter. But there were a number of modules that clustered differently. One is the temporoparietal, the one in purple, and I've highlighted here. You can see that there's a nice, almost a dorsal auditory pathway here, but in the adults who stutter, there's only the temporal portion of it. The parietal portion is gone. It's not gone. It's connected to another module. Then you have the lateral orbital frontal module, and you can see the differences here. In the case of the healthy controls, there's a significant component of this frontal region that optimized with the prefrontal and frontal cortex, whereas that was not the case for the adults who stutter. And then the posterior medial lateral, the one in gold, you can see that it is a different module, and in the adults who stutter, this mid-temporal and inferior temporal is bilaterally organized when that's not the case in the healthy controls. There's also the frontoparietal module in green that was lateralized to the right hemisphere in the healthy controls, but not for the individuals who stutter. And in the healthy controls, this frontotemporal module included the putamen, the globus pallidus, and the thalamus, while for the adults who stutter, this module was bilaterally organized, which I just mentioned, but no subcortical structures were contained. So using the same number of modules, we looked at the results from this weighted stochastic block model. And the first thing you can see, I think, is pretty interesting, is that the block model resulted in more segregated modules on the left hemisphere for the adults who stutter. So you have the purple module here, the blue here. I can't remember their names, so I'm just going with the colors. But you can see that this is fractionated or segregated, but in the healthy controls, the left hemisphere, frontal and parts of the parietal, and even part of the superior temporal gyrus is all a single module. For the healthy controls, the frontal and parietal regions on the left hemisphere in blue are a single module. For the adults who stutter, the same regions make up 2 modules. I apologize, I just said the same thing twice. And the cerebellum is also more fractionated for the adults who stutter compared to the healthy controls. The left hemisphere clustered to the left superior temporal gyrus, the right hemisphere and bilateral posterior hemisphere clustered to the right temporal lobe and the posterior parietal cortex. And you can kind of see here the healthy controls, you've got a superior inferior kind of organization, whereas in the adults who stutter, it's more lateralized. The right hemisphere contains 2 modules for both groups. However, the sensory motor portion of the modules, precentral and submarginal, supramarginal gyri, are clustered differently. This was kind of interesting. This is for the healthy controls. This is the premotor. This is the motor cortex, and here's the supramarginal gyrus. You can see that they clustered the same. In the adults who stutter, it's really the posterior or the postcentral gyrus that. I'm sorry, Siri's talking to me. So there's a different fractionization of the precentral and postcentral gyrus. And also, if you look at the medial motor area, what you can see is that for the healthy controls, they it is bilaterally organized, and it's somewhat connected to the right hemisphere. In the adults who stutter, it's broken up and distributed across the two, which to some extent makes more sense based on the functional data showing differences in the Aslan tract and differences in SMA activation for stuttering. There were also default mode network and limbic structures that clustered differently, but I can't show them to you in these views. So both approaches yield evidence of adaptive changes in structural network organization for the adults who stutter. The results from max modularity yielded differences in lateralization, right hemisphere, prefrontal cortical organization, and subcortical distribution. The similar cerebellum and medial wall organizations are consistent with functional differences previously observed in the cerebellum and SMA, reflecting connectivity differences rather than atypical organization. So if you look at the maximum modularity results, which showed that the structures were similarly organized in terms of their components, but then the differences were noted in the weighted stochastic block model, I think that tells us that it's really connectivity differences that are the defining factor in those two regions. The results using weighted stochastic block model revealed changes in network architecture and connectivity. And in some cases, they were consistent with studies of functional connectivity. In other cases, they weren't, but included the left hemisphere prefrontal cortex, the medial wall and cerebellum, right hemisphere temporoparietal cortex, and the default mode and limbic structures. So the last thing I want to go over quickly, and it's a little controversial to some extent. It hasn't been well established in the literature, but it's kind of cool. And that is looking at controllability. And this is where network control theory has been applied to graph theoretical results. So a system is called controllable if it can be driven to any desired state. So controllability metrics provide summary statistics regarding the ease with which a given subnetwork can enact influences on the network. So there are two metrics, average and modal controllability. So average controllability measures the extent to which controlling a single node can drive the network to states that are nearby in the energy landscape of the network states. So here you have a node here, and if you're going to drive this this way or that way, that's relatively easy, and it's nearby in the energy landscape. In contrast, if modal controllability measures the extent to which controlling a single node can drive the network to states that are distant in the energy landscape, that require more energy to get there. So, or to surmount large energy barriers. So we did our controllability analysis, and we only found one significant difference, or two significant differences. And it was only in one module. We had to use the maximum modularity results because you need modules that are fairly similar. What we found in the frontal subnetwork in red is that the average controllability for the adults who stutter was higher. So that means that that suggests that it's using that to drive the network to states that are nearby in the energy landscape. and doesn't require as much energy as in terms of modal controllability. We found just the opposite, and that is for the adults who stutter, it was lower than the controls. And so that means that there are regions that drive, there are nodes that drive the network to states that are distant in the energy landscape. That would be more, they have more difficulty. They would have more difficulty in that. So there were no other significant differences. This sounds kind of, I don't know, airy-fairy in some sense, but I think that what was kind of interesting is that when you look at the nodes or the regions that are contained within this subnetwork, within the frontal region or the red module, what you find is that there are nodes missing for the adults who stutter. And in the left hemisphere, the nodes that are missing are the Rolandic operculum, the insula, the supramarginal gyrus, Heschel's gyrus, and superior temporal gyrus. So what you can see here in the box is that here's the Rolandic operculum and the insula, and you have the STG and Heschel's gyrus. Over here in the adults who stutter, those structures are part of another module. What does that mean? Well, I would speculate, and this is really highly speculative, but it sounds good to me, is that the higher average controllability, which means that for stutterers it was higher, it may reflect a decoupling of the sensory and sensory motor regions to allow the individual to produce fluent speech. So we know that if you look at the fluent speech of stutterers, no matter how you look at it, you can use the right lens, you're going to find some differences in the fluent speech, but they are fluent. But this might suggest that the reason that that is possible is because this particular component, or these particular components of the network, the operculum, postcentral gyrus, the insula, SMG, Heschel's gyrus, and STG, have been decoupled from the frontal network, and it makes it an easier task. If you look at the structures that are missing in the right hemisphere, what's missing are is the superior frontal region and the midfrontal region, which are associated with executive control, response inhibition, etc., and the lower modal connectivity, which means that it would, which is lower for the adults who stutter, means that it would be more difficult to drive the system into energy states that require more energy. And so this may reflect reduced executive control, response inhibition, attention, and decoupling of emotional processing associated with the missing right hemisphere regions. Speculative, but we're following up on it. So I'm about to put you all out of your misery, and we'll go through the summary. In a cohort of adults who stutter, analysis of structural network properties derived from diffusion-weighted imaging using network-based statistics and graph theoretical measures, we identified a number of adaptive changes associated with reduced structural connectivity across multiple brain areas. The structural alterations in the adults who stutter reflect multiple brain areas that impact or have impacted the speech motor system. This is kind of an important concept, and that is that when we're looking at structural changes, we're looking at something that has occurred over a significant period of time, and it essentially it almost gives you a history of what's gone on neurally. It's not the same as functional activity, but it is the wiring that's associated, and that has been in some way adapted to deal with all of the multiple impacts of the disorder over the course of the lifetime. The regions, modules, and networks were associated with both sensory motor, limbic, and transmodal networks. The default mode network keeps popping up so many times, highlighting the diverse impact of stuttering across the lifespan. Differences in the organization of network hubs and modules suggest reduced sub-network efficiency and increased processing load for adults who stutter. And the controllability findings suggest a difference in the functional utility of the frontal cortex in switching brain states, potentially impacting, again, sensory, motor, cognitive, and emotional processing. So in final summary, the current data highlight the relevance of developing a deeper understanding of the brain network topology to fully interpret the impact of persistent stuttering on neural organization. And this has particular relevance, I think, to diagnostics or diagnosis, and especially subtyping. And this is an area that people have talked about a lot, subtyping and different ways of going about it. And I think that this particular kind of approach, looking at the structural networks and the structural network, the connectivity patterns, the adaptive changes may be an important way of neurosubtyping. And it also provides important information, I think, once we get a good handle on the extent of the changes and the heterogeneity of the associated with the disorder to provide innovative and precision treatments for stuttering. And with that, I'm going to thank you for your attention. And I'll sit down now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gracco, for that. I think it's time for us to open up the floor for questions. We have quite a few questions that have come through. I think, Frank, if you agree, we should maybe cluster the questions for the presenters and kind of stay within one topic at a time.
That's
How
fine.
does that sound?
That sounds good.
Okay. Let's start with Jeffrey, since you were the first to present. Let me see. I'm going to make this question visible here. Thanks for the great talk. How does proactivity relate to movement inhibition control? Are there shared processes?
So the task I was referring to, the AX continuous performance task, involves a host of executive functions in terms of attention and working memory, and certainly inhibition. The task is often called the proactive inhibition task. So I would say there's overlapping architecture in the very theoretical sense. I would say that proactive control is less your baseline inhibition and more what you do with it. It's inhibition plus experience. So I would say that Shanley Treleaven's talk is more of a baseline inhibition, a reactive inhibition, because during her task, the participant was cued to respond and then told to stop. And in mine, you're planning ahead and coming up with a strategy to if they want to inhibit or not. So certainly differences in inhibition would affect the performance on the task, but the task is designed more so to be the cognitive control of inhibition and what the person has learned to do based on previous experiences.
Great, thank you. I think we have 3 questions for Torrey. So the first one, has it ever been tested retrospectively whether children who stutter already had higher speech motor variability before their stuttering onset?
I haven't seen any studies that do that. I know that they have looked at speech motor variability in children who are very young, going probably into preschoolers now already. And for those children who stutter, for whom are COFD now, thank you, Vince, who have COFD, their variability is higher, even near close to onset.
Okay, great. Another question for you. There is considerable evidence that rate and STI are highly correlated. How do you know it's not duration that's driving variability?
I think I correct that, and I say they're associated but not correlated. We haven't seen tight correlations between STI and duration in our data, but definitely as you move towards having a longer duration for your speech, variability does, but not invariably. In our talk earlier today, speech motor duration increased when DAF was applied, but variability did not go up. So it's a complex relationship, and you see associations, but not correlations.
Okay. Shall we move on to Dr. Treleaven and her questions?
Sure.
Okay. Do you want to go for it, Frank?
Sure. The first question is, are there any key differences in the studies that did and did not find differences in SSRT? And congrats on your new doctorate.
Well, thank you, first of all. And let me know if you can't hear me. I think that the biggest key differences, and by biggest, I mean they're actually very small, that were kind of knee-jerk, was the previous studies Dr. Coalson and I did that found SSRT differences used an auditory stop signal, whereas the study that I just discussed used a visual stop signal. So the stimulus changed colors to tell the person to stop, whereas in the previous studies there was a beep. But a previous study by Marquette et al. Had both, and he found with auditory and visual stop signals, there were significant differences between groups. So the differences aren't very obvious here. I think one thing that will help in future studies, though, is in 2019, Verbruggen and a whole bunch of colleagues released a guide for how to do stop signal research. And it kind of asks for more transparency and more data that'll help us to compare studies in the future. So because studies from before 2019 rightfully didn't have all of that data, it'll be harder to compare, but I think now it will be. So I'm hoping future people will study this and we can compare better.
Great. And then one more question. Did you also exclude the participants with ADHD for the analyses of the OASIS?
Yes, we did. We did, and when we took out those participants, the results remained the same.
Great. Next speaker.
All right, Vince. I believe we have a couple for you. Okay. You mentioned that the differences between adults who stutter and adults who don't stutter represent adaptive changes in neurodevelopment. How do you separate that from organization related to the onset of stuttering that may remain in adulthood?
Well, I'm not sure I see a distinction because if we're talking about and maybe I just don't understand the question, but you have a neurodevelopmental disorder. In this case, it starts at some age and continues throughout the lifespan. So as things change, I mean, we're going through neurodevelopment up through, 18, 20 years of age. And even after that, the assumption that there's not any change after that is probably is not tenable based on the data. So I would say that it's a continuous process, and as the child grows older, he has to or she has to adapt to what is available to them, and they just continue to do that. I'm not sure I answered the question, but I'm not entirely sure what the question was focused on specifically.
I think you did a nice job of getting to their question. There was one more question for you, Vince, but it was posted near the beginning of your presentation, and I'm not sure what slide it's in relation to, but we did get 4 upvotes, so there must have been a few people with a similar question. The question says, "Hi, Vince, I may have missed this, but what graph metric are you showing here, and how are you correcting for multiple comparisons?" And this would have been early in your talk. If you were able to
I saw that question come in, and it was while you were showing individual connections rather than it was right before you went into the graph theory.
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
Well, so that essentially is we used permutation analysis to build up the null distribution. Kind of a fairly characteristic way of getting around the problem of multiple comparisons and avoiding having to use uncorrected data. So it was based on setting up a t-statistic that was based on the effect size and 5,000 permutations to build up the null distribution to give you what exactly the t-statistic was associated with p less than 0.05. So.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank all of our presenters for session 12. This was a really great afternoon and a wealth of knowledge.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.